Hi, my name's Sheldon Livesey. This is Appalachian Christian Network, and we're in for a treat not only today, but we're in for a treat all through the year this year, because this is the 250th anniversary of the nation this year. We're celebrating being 250 years old, and we're still under the same founding document. Do you realize that this is the longest founding document of any nation on this earth? The Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, which guides us today, are those documents. And so our government is going to celebrate. And we're going to celebrate today. You're going to have a series of videos telling a little bit about the founding of our nation. These were done in cooperation with the White House and Hillsdale University. There's many great sponsors, and I want to call your attention to a few of those. And I want to invite you to go and study beyond what we're going to be doing. Wallbuilders.org, David Barton and his organization has over 100,000 of the original documents of our founding fathers, proving beyond a shadow of doubt that these men were not just spiritually driven. They were not just men of faith, but they were outstanding men of faith that understood Bibles better than most of us do today, and they could take the applications of those Bibles and lay them down as the foundation for the bedrock and the foundation of our nation, on which we are governed today. The freedoms that we enjoy, the inalienable rights that we are given through our Constitution, are those rights that have driven this nation in the past. We have Patriots Academy, Prager University, the National Religious Broadcasters Conference and Organization, the US 250 Tour. There's going to be some 20 tour buses that are museums in themselves, and they're going to be traveling the United States this year, going from city to city so that people can board them and get a better understanding of the history of our nation. So again, I'm going to invite you to go to freedom250.org. Freedom250.org is sponsored by the White House, and there will be many videos besides what we're going to be seeing today. And then we're going to come back throughout this year, and we're going to have many videos talking about the freedoms of our nation, the founding of our nation, the faith of our founding fathers, and all of those things to help us get a better understanding and appreciation for this nation that was given to us by our founders some 250 years ago. Let's go now to the first video.
Hello, I'm Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, and I'm honored to welcome you to the Indian Treaty Room in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, part of the White House complex. President Trump wishes to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence next year with an open heart. The college is honored because it loves the Declaration of Independence. Our oldest building was dedicated on the 4th of July in 1853. Then the president of the college at that time, who became known to Abraham Lincoln, gave a speech in which he said, "Freedom and learning go together, and ignorance and slavery go together." One of the things we must do to commemorate anything, commemorate just means to remember together. First, we have to know the thing. And we can't remember it very well if we don't know it very well. And so part of the purpose of this series of lectures is to remember. President Trump does this in part, I think. I don't speak for him. But the word again is important to him. He has a famous slogan that I will not repeat here, but everybody knows what it is. And it ends with the word again. He wants to do something again. Something already been done. He wants to see it happen again. This places him somewhere near the politics of Abraham Lincoln, I think. George Washington did something for the first time, extremely honorable, including the defense of the Declaration of Independence on battlefields. Abraham Lincoln comes along later, and he wants to restore all of that. He took the view that that was a very hard thing to do, but it wasn't a new thing to do. It was something that we should remember and commemorate. In introducing this series, I want to begin by encouraging you to read the Declaration of Independence. It's just over 1,300 words long. It is one of the most consequential and beautiful political documents in all of history. You should read it again and again. You should memorize the beginning of it. It's very beautiful. It is grand and eternal and eloquent, and it proclaims the rights of us all. It begins universally. When in the chorus, that means anytime. One people, that means any people. It refers to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Those would be eternal laws, laws that we don't make, laws that are ever and forever. The terms the Declaration of Independence means that it's true now if it was true then. And it means that if it's not true now, it was not true then. It excludes any idea of a change in the fundamental conditions. Absorb that and then go on to the next section. The next section raises some claims against the King of England that justify our revolution. The particular claim is that he has violated his rightful powers by invading the authority of the legislature, which indicates separation of powers would be right, and that he has interfered with representation, our ability to elect our government, which means consent of the governed has been interfered with, and he's interfered with the judicial branch. Separation of powers, consent of the governed, representation. Those things are the very structure of the Constitution of the United States, later made to defend the principles and institutionalize the principles of the Declaration of Independence, according at least to those who wrote it, and to later the very great Abraham Lincoln. If you learn those things, it's a sort of guide to the understanding of American politics. After the charges against the king comes a particular, also very beautiful, final section that becomes so particular it is confined at the end to the actual people in the room voting to approve the Declaration of Independence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It starts out with all eternity, and it ends up with those people and that room and everything they have pledged to this eternal cause. It becomes the American cause, the cause of our people, formed under principles of all people by a resolution they made unto death to defend it. That, I think, is the foundation stone of America right there. In the course of the American Revolution, in April of 1775, in two villages in Massachusetts, a bunch of people, first about 70, then maybe 3,500, were called out to fire the shot heard round the world. Several hundred British regulars were coming down the road to seize an arms depot and, you might say, assert the might of the British Empire. And they gathered to stop them. And they did. They were organized to do that. Somehow it wasn't just individuals rising up. They had already bound together to cooperate. It's a very stirring story. And we have the marvelous Bill McClay, a colleague of mine, a historian, tremendous teacher. He's one of our best. He's written many books. He fell in love in history a long time ago after a classical education. And I commend one of his books in particular to you. I think the best one-volume history of the United States ever written is called Land of Hope. Listen to him and enjoy and think about your liberties and their structure and the Declaration of Independence. This first lecture is about that shot heard around the world. It was April 19th, 1775, and Bill McClay will tell us about it.
I've been asked to say a few words about the religious faith of America's founders and why it matters. Hi, I'm Mark David Hall, a professor in the Robertson School of Government at Regent University. Let me begin by observing that a lot of nonsense has been written about the faith of America's founders. Scholars and popular authors alike routinely assert that they were Enlightenment deists who desired to strictly separate church and state. Nothing could be further from the truth. On September 24, 1789, the House of Representatives approved what would become the First Amendment, an amendment that includes these important words: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those who oppose religion in public life often point to this amendment as evidence that the founders wanted to build a wall of separation between church and state. But consider this. The day after the House approved the First Amendment, Elias Boudinot, who later became president of the American Bible Society, proposed that Congress ask President Washington to recommend a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. In response to objections by Adonias Burke and Thomas Tucker that such a practice mimicked European customs or should be done by the states, Connecticut's Roger Sherman justified the practice of Thanksgiving on any signal event not only as laudable in itself, but as warranted by a number of precedents in Holy Writ. For instance, the solemn thanksgivings and rejoicings which took place in the time of Solomon. The House agreed with Boudinot and Sherman, as did the Senate. Congress requested that President Washington issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation. He didn't have to, but he did. On October 3, 1789, Washington issued a proclamation designating Thursday, November 26 as a national day of prayer and thanksgiving. Whereas it is a duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and to humbly implore His protection and favor, I do recommend the people of these states to the service of the great and glorious being who is a beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be, that we may then unite in rendering unto Him our sincere and humble thanks, and also that we may then unite in our most humble offerings and prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech Him to pardon our national and other transgressions, to enable us all, whether in our public or private stations, to perform our several and relative duties properly and punctually, to render our national government a blessing to all people. President Washington encouraged prayer, but he did not attempt to compel it. America's founders saw nothing wrong with civic leaders endorsing religious practices like prayer, but they had also come to a consensus that there must be no compulsion in matters of faith. In the late 18th century, 98% of Americans of European descent were Protestant, 2% were Roman Catholic, and there were about 2,000 Jews in 4 American cities. Although it is often claimed that many of the founders were deists, that label may be applied to only a handful of individuals. Now, Protestants are people of the book, that is, the Bible. So if faith was important to the founders, one would expect them to make significant use of the scriptures in their political writings. And they did. Donald Lutz conducted an impressive study of the pamphlets, articles, and books on political subjects in late 18th century America. The study found that the Bible was cited far more often than any other book, article, or pamphlet at the time. Indeed, the founders referenced the Bible more than all European authors combined, 34% to 22%. Think about that, 34% of all citations are to the Bible alone, only 22% to Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, Montesquieu, or Adam Smith. Did the founders' religious convictions make a difference in the creation of America's constitutional order? Absolutely they did. The Declaration of Independence. Its central paragraph relies on a theological claim. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For almost all of the founders, God is the source of natural rights, and it is a primary duty of government to protect these rights. Many Enlightenment thinkers in the era supported a strong centralized government run by experts. But America's founders would have nothing to do with this because they believed that humans are sinful. In Federalist 51, James Madison observed that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. This led them to design a constitutional order characterized by the separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Critically, the founders believed that humans were created in the imago Dei, the image of God. In his 1793 Supreme Court opinion in Chisholm v. Georgia, Justice James Wilson, paraphrasing Psalm 139, observed that man, fearfully and wonderfully made, is a workmanship of his all-perfect Creator. He echoed this conviction in his law lectures, noting that innocent life must always be protected. He wrote with evident approval that, with consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law. Many founders were also coming to recognize that slavery fundamentally undermines the idea that all humans are created in God's image, and so they were coming to oppose it. This is why the Confederation Congress passed and the First Federal Congress reauthorized the Northwest Ordinance, a law that prohibits slavery in the territories, which became the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. As well, 8 states north of Maryland abolished or put slavery on the path to extinction between 1777 and 1804. Finally, the founders understood the Christian faith to require the robust protection of religious liberty for all. This is illustrated well by George Mason's draft of Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which reads, that as religion, or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate. Note how Mason's provision is grounded in the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator. Now, this is not a bad provision, but James Madison, in his first significant public act, objected to the use of the word toleration in the article, believing that it implied that religious liberty was a grant from the state that could be revoked at will. The Virginia Convention agreed, and Article 16, which had a profound influence on subsequent state constitutions and the National Bill of Rights, was amended to remove the language of toleration to make it clear that the free exercise of religion is a right, not a privilege granted by the state. By the end of the Revolutionary era, every state constitution offered significant protection to religious liberty. The Federal Constitution of 1787 did not have a religious liberty provision per se, but Article 6 prohibits religious tests for federal office. Now, some objected that this would allow non-Christians to be elected to federal office. Federalists conceded that this was the case, and many undoubtedly thought this outcome unlikely. But fortunately, they insisted on a constitution that did not favor one religious tradition over another. Anti-Federalists thought the Constitution did not sufficiently protect religious liberty, and they insisted that a Bill of Rights be added to it. In the face of popular outcry, the first Congress proposed, and the states ratified a constitutional amendment prohibiting Congress from making a law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This provision clearly bans Congress from creating a national church, and it goes well beyond protecting the freedom of worship. It insists that citizens have the right to the free exercise of religion. Not only did the founders understand that religious liberty must be robustly protected, they recognized that religious convictions of all Americans must be carefully guarded. I already mentioned Article 6's prohibition on religious tests, but let me close by returning to President Washington. In 1790, he wrote a letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Keep in mind, there were only about 2,000 Jewish citizens in America, and they had little political or economic power. As a matter of principle, not politics, President Washington insisted that all citizens possess alike liberty and conscience and the immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Like James Madison, Washington emphasized that Americans have moved beyond toleration to respecting the inherent natural right of all people to the free exercise of religion. Washington closed this letter with the following paragraph. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell on this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. There are 9 scriptural references in this last paragraph. One of them is to Micah 4:4, which reads, "While everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." This was George Washington's favorite Bible verse. He quoted or paraphrased it more than 50 times in his writings. Today, we give thanks for our founders' religious faith and for their wisdom and foresight in protecting the sacred right of conscience in the First Amendment. Now, it is up to every generation to protect these rights, to ensure that every American can sit under his own vine and fig tree and never be afraid. Thank you for joining me.
In order to form a more perfect union. Our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
Hello, my name is Larry Arnn. I'm the president of Hillsdale College, which is honored to be working with the White House to produce these videos in honor of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the greatest political document in human history. Our college was founded in honor of that document. We encourage you to love it and to celebrate it. And to celebrate it, you should learn about it. We're going to talk about 2 things, the meaning and the structure of the Declaration of Independence. First question is, what does it mean? Things have causes. There's a classical account of the causes of things that include 4. The efficient cause means whoever made it. The material cause means whatever it's made out of. The formal cause means what does it look like and how does it operate? And the final cause is what is it for? What love produces it? Declaration of Independence contains a lot of information about the formal cause of America in the middle, but its chief function is to provide the final cause of the country. What is the country for? And it begins very beautifully by explaining that. It says that any time in history, any people in history have a right under the laws of nature and of nature's God to form a nation according to purposes that they adopt. What are these laws of nature and nature's God? What does that mean? The Christian view is that God made nature the classical view is that each being has a good, and the good and the being are the same thing. Nature is full of things that are good, and it's wrong to violate the good of anything. What do these laws say about people? They say that they're all created equal. Think what a remarkable thing it is for a people to adopt a standard like that as their purpose, as their governing purpose. And we did that in opposition to a king who claimed that he was born to be our ruler, because he was better born than we are. He was denying the proposition that all men are created equal. If you recognize this principle of equality and you recognize it properly, it will give rise to the most amazing diversity and difference among people, because it sets up a right of all of us to pursue our lives best we can, without impediment by kings and emperors. We said, in the laws of nature and nature's God, no one is born to rule anybody else. And that's beautiful, and it sets up an agitation in the country which goes on to this day to always try to recognize those principles. And that's the final cause of the United States of America. Now a word about the structure of the document. It begins with this universal claim that we're all created equal and that nobody may rule us except by our consent. And in the middle bit they claim the king has done a bunch of bad stuff that justifies the revolution. He took houses away from people and put troops in them. That means they were dislodged. They were driven out into the street. He arrested people. He put them on ships. And the ships were not very comfortable. They were in the hold of the ship. Sometimes they sat around for weeks in the harbor. And they were taken all the way to England. Most of them had never been there before. And they were put on trial in front of people who they never met before, not a jury of your peers. This is the 25th paragraph. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He did kill people. And then he'd talk about the mercenaries there. Large armies of foreign mercenaries, those were the Hessians, to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely parallel in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. But then that leads us to the second thing about this structure point, and that was some of them are direct violations of the best method, the founders argued the only sure method, to keep the government from doing things like that to you, to its citizens, to anybody, right? And those methods are, they provide the organizing principle of the Constitution of the United States. They are representation. The Continental Congress that passed the Declaration of Independence took great pains to be a representative body. That is to say, they're not acting according to their own wills. Somebody else, those who will be governed under this new government that they're creating, have appointed us to do this. We are acting for them. We have government by consent. And they say that the king is interfering with the legislatures that they had had before. He dissolved several of them, and he prevented others of them from meeting. And those are all in these charges here, right? He has obstructed government by consent. Then he's messed around with the judicial branch. And that means that the legislature has to pass a law, and then the executive enforces only the laws that have been passed. And then when the law is applied upon any citizen, he has to be taken in front of a judge who's not dismissible by the legislature or the executive. And then the judge has to decide. That's called the independent judiciary. It's a terribly important thing. So the middle bit of the Declaration, these 28 paragraphs, is the second part of the structure of the Declaration of Independence. And the third part is a formal legislative act that makes the nation. It's passed by the Continental Congress. I should mention that God appears 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. He appears in the first sentence as the maker of the laws of nature and nature's God, the legislator. He appears in the beginning of the second paragraph as the endower of our rights, as creator, the founder of everything. The last paragraph is personal. They refer to themselves for the first time. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States, we, in General Congress assembled. And then they appeal to somebody to judge whether they're right. And that person is not the King of England. It's the supreme judge of the world, the judicial branch. For the rectitude of our intentions, in other words, we swear we're doing what seems right, and we ask God to judge. In the name of the good people of these colonies. You can read it as a claim that the people of the colonies are good. You can read it as a claim that we're acting for the good ones. Or you can read it as the claim we have to remember to be good because we are assuming this authority now. Free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war. Now we get to the hard thing. Conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And then the beautiful last sentence. This is where the executive branch comes in. Because see, now it's war. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. That's God as the executive branch. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Only in the hands of God would all the powers of government be combined. Those men in that room, the same room where the Constitution would later be written by some of the same people, we mutually pledge to each other everything we've got. We Americans today owe those people. We should learn about them. Thank you.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
By September of 1776, the cause of independence looked bleak. Though Washington had miraculously escaped the British after the Battle of Long Island, the defeat of the American army had been a humiliating rout. Washington had made a number of mistakes, and some began to speak about replacing him, whether with General Charles Lee or with Horatio Gates. And what followed in the next 3 months only confirmed this assessment. The worst of it came on November 16th, when American forces were defeated in the northern end of Manhattan at Fort Washington. Washington ought to have abandoned Manhattan entirely, but for some reason he took the advice of Nathanael Greene and left 5,000 men there. From across the Hudson River, through his spyglass, Washington watched their awful defeat. The Hessian mercenaries even bayoneted men to death who were trying to surrender. Knowing that the responsibility for it all fell on him was crushing. And a number of his officers saw Washington so overwhelmed that he turned away and wept like a child. 4 days later, Washington's troops were chased from Fort Lee, New Jersey. But at this point, Washington knew that he must fight differently, and he would. The plan going forward was to retreat with his remaining army south through New Jersey, never allowing the British to engage them in a full and open fight in which the British would have the advantage. It would be what Washington called a war of posts, in which he retreated and retreated, trying to wear out the British as he did so. If Washington and his men continued to retreat successfully, they would eventually make it to the Delaware River, which formed the westernmost border of New Jersey. They could then escape across the Delaware, where they would effectively be safe, having the wide river between them and the British, and also being able to keep the British from advancing on Philadelphia. So if Washington had any hope of reversing the fortunes of his Continental Army, he had to do it in the next few weeks. It really didn't seem like things could get worse, until Washington heard that General Charles Lee, whom he had again and again begged to come to his aid with his 2,000 troops, had been captured by the British. In fact, the British were so thrilled by this tremendous coup that General Howe decided it was time to call it a year and retire to winter quarters. The situation was that Washington and his ragged troops were huddled in Pennsylvania, and General Charles Lee, whom the British feared far more as a general than they feared the beleaguered Washington, was their captive. So, Cornwallis made plans to sail back to London to see his wife, and Howe went to New York, where he expected to spend the winter with his mistress. A number of Hessian troops would, of course, be stationed in encampments along the Delaware on the New Jersey side, just to keep an eye on Washington and his forces. But the British thought that the campaign for 1776 was over. Washington was simply so defeated at this point that there was little reason to worry about him. In the spring, the British could rouse themselves to end things finally, once and for all. It was around this time of deepest desperation that Washington knew he must do something. If he did nothing now, it really was essentially over for the cause of liberty and independence. On December 31st, most of his men, having come to the end of their enlistment, would go home. But what could Washington do? He would first of all take advantage of the overconfidence of the British, who didn't dream he and his exhausted forces would do anything dramatic at this point. He'd also take advantage of the fact that, in their overconfidence, they had scattered their forces in a line along the river that was perhaps a little bit too thin. For example, there were only 1,500 men at Trenton. Over the past weeks, Thomas Paine, who was with Washington's army, began to write another essay. This new one, titled The American Crisis, began with the famous lines, "These are the times that try men's souls." The essay was so inspiring that Washington had it read aloud to all of his troops 2 days before the planned crossing of the Delaware. The exact plan was, in fact, for 3 forces to cross the Delaware. One force would cross many miles downstream to attack the Hessians who were stationed at Mount Holly in order to prevent them from coming to the aid of those he would be attacking in Trenton. A second force would cross the river right at Trenton to hold the Assunpink Bridge and prevent the Hessians from retreating. And the third and largest force with Washington and his generals Greene and Sullivan, would cross the river north at McConkey's Ferry. The plan was to be across by midnight and then to march the 9 miles to Trenton, where they would attack the Hessians at daybreak. When they arrived at the river, wet and cold, they saw that it was higher than usual and choked all the way across by huge and jagged floes of ice. Washington's full force was not assembled on the other side until 4 a.m., 4 hours past schedule, meaning that with 9 miles to march, they would not get to Trenton until well after daylight, destroying the vital element of surprise. The snowstorm continued as they marched, and it was so cold that 2 men froze to death en route. It was nearly 8 a.m. by the time they finally arrived at Trenton. The snowstorm was still raging, so the Hessians were not expecting anyone to attack. When Washington gave Nathanael Greene the order to do so, the Hessians standing guard were overwhelmed and quickly retreated into the town. A few moments later, from another direction, General Sullivan's troops attacked. The Hessians could not have been more surprised. The idea that Washington would, with all these men, have crossed the Delaware on Christmas night in a snowstorm and marched through the snowstorm 9 miles to Trenton was simply inconceivable. So the Hessians tumbled out of their barracks and desperately tried to marshal a defense. But Henry Knox's artillery were stationed at the head of the 2 main streets and blasted cannon fire, clearing them immediately. The fighting moved onto the side streets. Eventually, the Hessians desperately retreated to an apple orchard, but were finally surrounded. Only an hour had passed, and it was all over. In the end, the Hessians counted 112 casualties, 22 killed and 90 wounded. On the American side, only 4 were wounded and not a single life was lost in battle. And the Americans had captured nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners. It was an astonishing victory. The news spread quickly. Those who had counted Washington out and who had counted the cause of liberty out realized that his bold stroke, successfully executed despite monumental obstacles, had changed the momentum of the war as dramatically as possible. Once more, the British knew that what they so assuredly believed was essentially finished was far from over. And of course, when it finally would be over, 7 years in the unimaginable future, they would have lost. The war and the colonies, both.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
It's commonly said about George Washington that he was the indispensable American. But there's ample evidence that John Adams may indeed be an indispensable American too. Though never a soldier, Adams fought for America's freedom in our nation's most important chapter. Few Americans in history have a political and diplomatic resume like Adams. Here's a list of some of the positions he held in public life. Massachusetts delegate to the Continental Congress. First U.S. minister to the Netherlands and Great Britain. America's first vice president and our second president, among many other prominent positions. Adams also authored several influential works on government, including, most notably, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which he wrote alone, and which is to this day the oldest written constitution in the world. It served as a model for the U.S. Constitution, specifically its focus on separation of powers among and between the branches of government. But there's much more to Adams' life than his resume, including real accomplishments and crucial battles fought and won for his country. Though Adams was impatient and viewed as too tactless for legislative life, he was a ferocious behind-the-scenes operator and ended up playing a big part in the most momentous decisions in our nation's fight for independence and beyond. His decision to nominate George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the colonial armies was as consequential an act as any he would perform. Adams first met Washington while the two served as delegates to the First Continental Congress. He was impressed with Washington's military experience and Washington's demeanor, and knew that to unify the colonies, he would need to choose someone to lead the Continental Army that was not a Yankee. Virginia was not just the richest colony, but the largest, and as David McCullough noted in his biography of Adams, quote, "The very proud Virginians felt they had a right to lead." In the Second Continental Congress, no delegate fought harder than Adams behind closed doors and on the House floor for the colonies to not merely sever ties with Great Britain, but declare independence outright. In May of 1776, it was Adams who called for the formal resolution for independence, and it was Adams who organized the committee charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Adams chose Thomas Jefferson, 33 years old at the time, and the youngest delegate for the task. He recognized Jefferson's ability to make words work above and beyond the call of common prose for what was to be the most important writing assignment in world history. After Adams and 55 others put their name to paper and pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, Adams penned these words to his bride Abigail about how that day should be remembered. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. Any one of these accomplishments would have been enough for anyone's lifetime, but there were more. Adams played a pivotal role in the fight for independence on the diplomatic field, securing critical funding from the government of France and negotiating a loan from Dutch bankers of nearly $2 million. It was funding needed on the home front for provisions, arms, and munitions necessary to secure military victory in America and independence thereafter. Adams wrote of his efforts later in his life, "If this had been the only action of my life, it would have been well spent." And there were his efforts, along with John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, on the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Paris established the United States as an independent nation and doubled the size of America. Lest we forget, Adams served as the second president of the United States and managed to keep the nation out of war. No small task, given the events in France, which was experiencing a revolution of its own. Despite blistering attacks from his own party, particularly from Alexander Hamilton, Adams sent a peace commission to France with hopes of averting war. He succeeded, but at great personal cost. So what do we need to know about Adams to best understand the man? It's first important to understand where he was born and to whom. Adams was not born to wealth. His father made his living as a farmer and shoemaker in the quiet village of 2,000 people called Braintree, Massachusetts. Baptized in the church where his father served as a deacon, Adams learned from him the necessity and importance of hard work, good habits, and trustworthiness. Adams wrote these words about his father after he died. A man of strict piety and great integrity, much esteemed and beloved wherever he was known, which was not far, his sphere of life being not extensive. The sphere of John Adams' life would extend far beyond Braintree to the great cities of America and Europe too. The turning point in Adams' life came in the form of a scholarship to Harvard at the age of 15. While there, Adams cultivated his appetite for reading, which lasted a lifetime. But it was his time debating that he discovered he'd make a better lawyer than preacher, much to his father's disappointment. After graduating in 1755, he pursued a legal career. Harvard Law wouldn't open its doors until 1817, so Adams did what aspiring lawyers did back then. He worked by day as a teacher to pay for his legal training with lawyers in and around Boston, launching his professional career in 1758. By 1770, he was one of the busiest lawyers in town. Then came the moment that tested Adams' commitment to the rule of law and provided posterity with a window into the character and courage of the man. At great risk to his practice, he chose to represent the Redcoats in the biggest case of his time, the Boston Massacre trial. Adams' rhetorical skills were on full display as he described how the mob pelted the British soldiers with every species of rubbish. One soldier, he said, was beaten to the ground with a club, rising up only to be beaten down again. Do you expect he should behave like a Stoic philosopher, lost in apathy? Adams asked the jurors, and by proxy, the entire city of Boston. Adams then explained to the jurors that the presumption of innocence is the bedrock of any civil society. Better that many guilty persons escape unpunished than one innocent person should be punished. Adams closed his case quoting Algernon Sidney, the English political theorist who wrote Discourses Concerning Government, a textbook that profoundly influenced our founding fathers. The law no passion can disturb, 'tis void of desire and fear, lust and anger. It does not enjoin that which pleases a weak, frail man, but without any regard to persons commands that which is good and punishes evil in all, whether rich or poor, high or low. 'Tis deaf, inexorable, inflexible. The jury was out less than 3 hours. 6 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. Adams suffered in the short term, losing half his law practice. But as time passed, his defense of the Redcoats enhanced his public standing. Years later, Adams concluded that this effort of his was one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. It was a trial that taught us all that unpopular people, or people we hate, and hate for good reason, must not be subject to the whims of the mob, or prosecutors doing the mob's bidding. That single story, more than any other, embodied the nature and character of Adams, and the country he would soon help to birth. The American Republic, after all, is built to protect the rights of Americans through law, not the mere opinions of man. In poor health in the summer of 1826, Adams, 90 years old at the time, was visited by some local leaders seeking a toast they could share for America's upcoming 50th birthday celebration. "I will give you independence forever." Asked if he would add to the toast, Adams replied, "Not a word." Adams died on July 4th, 1826, not long after Jefferson, who died remarkably on the very same day, just hours earlier. His last words before dying, "Jefferson lives." In a letter to Abigail written decades earlier on a matter concerning the raising of their children, Adams wrote, "Fire them with ambition to be useful." At great personal risk to his family, health, and wealth, Adams served his country like few others have before or after. What more could Adams have done to earn the honorific, indispensable American? It's a question worth asking and answering as we approach our nation's 250th birthday celebration.
We invite you to visit the Shepherd Center. The Shepherd Center thrift store is located in downtown Rogersville, offering wonderful lines of many brands of men's, ladies, and children's clothing and shoes, housewares, used furniture, and electronics, now with expanded lines of gift items. Personal care items are also available at discounted prices. Remember, your support of the nonprofit Shepherd Center helped support missions programs which served over 100,000 people last year, including the Emergency Food Program.